1964, Mississippi. There are summers that happen in sunlight and summers that happen in paperwork. Freedom. Summer is remembered as a campaign, young people fanning out on rural roads, clipboards in hand, asking black citizens to do the most dangerous thing in the Deep South, sign their names and claim the right to vote. That's the story people tell when they want hope. But the record, what survives of it, tells you something colder. It tells you that the violence was not a sudden storm. It was a system with habits. It had procedures. It had budgets and uniforms and friendly judges and routine arrests. It had names for what it did, and the names were designed to wash the blood out of the sentence. Incident, disturbance, unknown persons, outside agitators, and then, behind all of that, another language, the language of silence, silence as policy, silence as protection, silence as a second weapon, used after the first one had done its work. Here is the uncomfortable claim I want to put on the table from the beginning. The most frightening part of Freedom Summer is not that people were attacked for registering black voters. The most frightening part is that the system was built to make those attacks disappear, first in the moment, then on paper, then in memory. And if you think that's exaggeration, if you think I'm romanticizing danger, listen to how the story begins when you stop listening to speeches and start listening to files. I want you to picture a room that does not look like terror. No masked men, no burning crosses, a room with fluorescent lights and metal shelves. A room where the horror is not dramatic, it's administrative. A file room, a locked archive, a place where the state kept its own story about what it did to keep white supremacy intact and what it did to those who challenged it. Decades after 1964, after the bodies had been buried and the headlines had cooled and the same families still held the same offices, the record began to leak. Not because the state had a moral awakening, because pressure was applied, lawsuits, court orders, demands that history stop being a private property. In Mississippi, the Sovereignty Commission, an official state agency created to resist civil rights, left behind a paper trail of surveillance, coordination, and quiet war against black political power. You can call it intelligence gathering if you want the euphemism. I call it what it was, a state-sponsored mechanism for intimidation and sabotage, dressed in letterhead. When those files became accessible, the shock was not that the state had watched people. The shock was the ordinary competence of it, the calm tone, the way lives were reduced to entries, the way protecting the state meant targeting citizens, and the files, even when opened, arrived incomplete. Redactions, gaps, missing pages. That's the trick, you see. Even disclosure can be controlled. Even confession can be edited. History isn't only erased by fire. It's erased by selective release, by indexing, by we can't locate that document, by decades of delay that turn evidence into rumor. So I'm going to start this investigation the way a prosecutor starts, with a contradiction. We are told Freedom Summer is a moral triumph, and in the long arc it is. But if you only tell it as triumph, you help the cover-up. You help the myth replace the ledger, because the ledger does not say moral triumph. The ledger says pressure, risk, missing people, burned churches, arrests used as punishment. The ledger says a state that understood the vote as a threat that must be neutralized. And it says something else. The vote was not merely obstructed, it was policed. It was treated like contraband. And the people attempting to claim it, mostly black Mississippians with a visible layer of young out-of-state volunteers, were treated as enemies of the local order, not metaphorically, practically. Now listen to the official story as it is usually told, clean and instructive. In the summer of 1964, civil rights organizations, working under a coalition, brought hundreds of volunteers into Mississippi. They aimed to register black voters and build parallel civic institutions, freedom schools for education and political literacy, community centers for organizing, and a political challenge to the all-white structure of representation. It is framed as the best of American youth, idealistic students, clergy, and organizers walking into a place that wanted them gone, believing that nonviolent persistence and national attention could break a caste system. That official story is not false, it's just incomplete. It is the story told in broad daylight, but there is another archive. I call it the human archive. It is made of the things that the official archive treats as disposable: oral testimony that never became a police report, letters written in fear, diaries that name the threats and the license plates, the church records of meetings held under the eye of men parked outside, the whispered instructions about which roads not to take after dark. The human archive is the story people carried because they could not trust the state to carry it for them. And the cruelest part is that we are trained, even now, to distrust the human archive unless the official archive validates it. We are trained to ask the victim to provide paperwork, as if the entire point of the system was not to prevent paperwork from existing in the first place. Freedom Summer sits at the intersection of these two archives. In the official archive, you see an operation: plans, training, schedules, organizational memos. You see a language of purpose. In the human archive, you see the cost, the constant calculation of danger, the way courage was measured in small acts that could trigger large punishments. The two archives are not merely different sources, they are different moral universes. One is designed to protect institutions, the other is designed to preserve lives. And the conflict between them is the real plot of this story. Here is what you must understand about Mississippi in 1964. This was not simply a prejudiced society. This was a fortified system. Voting rights were not denied with a simple no. They were denied through procedures that could be defended as neutral, even while they were engineered to fail black applicants. Registrars could apply literacy tests subjectively. Forms could become traps, requirements could shift, and when procedure was not enough, intimidation finished the job, not always in the open. Not always with spectacular violence, often with the slow certainty that if you tried, you would pay. You might lose your job, your home, your safety. Your name would be spoken in the wrong place. Your children would be threatened. Your church would be burned. The vote, in that environment, was not a ballot. It was a declaration that you would no longer accept your assigned position. And systems built on hierarchy tend to interpret that declaration as war. The Freedom Summer organizers knew this. That's why the project was not simply, let's register voters. It was also, let's force the country to look. Bringing volunteers from outside Mississippi, many of them young and white, was not a sentimental choice. It was a tactical one. The country ignored black suffering with a practiced ease, but if violence touched white college students, the cameras might stay. The newspapers might print. Washington might feel compelled to act. That is not a flattering fact about America, but it is a fact. Freedom Summer was built on the brutal realism that visibility can be a form of protection. Imperfect, late, and uneven, but sometimes the only protection available. And so the summer begins with orientation, training, logistics. It begins the way institutions begin: meetings, instructions, lists. Yet even in those preparations, the true nature of the terrain leaks through. People are told how to handle harassment, what to do if arrested, how to avoid isolated roads at night, how to contact legal support. In other words, they prepare for violence the way you prepare for weather in a storm season, not as a possibility, as an expectation. That is your first receipt. The fact that the project required a safety protocol at all, the fact that nonviolent civic participation had to be approached like a combat operation, the fact that the state's normal functions, police, courts, registrars, were not assumed to be neutral actors, but potential instruments of punishment. Now, the moment you begin to read Freedom Summer through the lens of erasure, certain patterns become visible. The first is language. The official story names heroes in a clean arc, but the system that opposed them used a different naming scheme. It labeled them agitators, communists, outside influences, troublemakers. It did not debate their demands. It questioned their legitimacy. It did not answer their claims. It attacked their right to make claims. And this was not limited to angry men in pickup trucks. It was embedded in official rhetoric, statements by local authorities, the posture of law and order that treated black political aspiration as disorder by definition. When a black Mississippian tried to register, that person was not framed as a citizen exercising a right. They were framed as a problem to be managed. The second pattern is record-keeping itself. In any society, there are people whose lives are carefully documented and people whose lives are allowed to vanish. In Mississippi, black lives were systematically undercounted in the ways that matter most: in credible complaints, in fair investigations, in the kind of documentation that forces accountability. When violence happened to black citizens, it could be treated as local noise. When violence happened to a volunteer from outside, it could become national scandal. That is not because black lives were less valuable. It is because the system was designed to make them easier to erase. Erasure is not an accident. It is a feature. So when you hear the phrase Freedom Summer, I want you to hear two summers running at once. One is the summer of organizing, meetings in churches, freedom schools teaching children and adults, canvassers walking door to door, people daring to speak the word vote in counties where it had been treated like profanity. The other is the summer of countermeasures, surveillance, intimidation, arrests, and violence. Some of it spontaneous, much of it enabled by the confidence that local institutions would not punish it. And then, very early, the summer produces its signature wound. June 21st, 1964. 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappear in Neshoba County. This is not the first act of violence in the movement, but it becomes a turning point because of visibility and because of what the case implies. The details matter because they expose the machinery. The men are stopped and detained. There is an arrest. There is a release. Then there is an absence where a routine drive should be. The story that tries to present this as a simple crime runs into a problem. The timeline brushes up against local law enforcement. And when law enforcement is part of the timeline, the case stops being criminal and becomes institutional. That is the moment America is forced, briefly, angrily, to confront a truth it preferred to outsource, that the terror was not merely private hatred, it could be public power. I'm not recounting this to sensationalize it. I'm recounting it because it reveals the governing logic of erasure. In a functioning system, an arrest record is supposed to be part of accountability. Here, an arrest becomes part of the trap. A release becomes part of the setup. Paperwork becomes the mask that allows violence to appear unconnected. And when the bodies are found, buried, concealed, Mississippi does what systems do when they are caught. It retreats into procedure and denial. The goal is not merely to avoid punishment, it is to control the narrative about what punishment would even mean. It is to keep the state itself from being put on trial. This is where the official story begins to fracture. Because the official story wants to be a story of inspiring youth activism met by crude racism. But the receipts show something more complicated and more damning. A modern system of suppression that could adapt. It could wear the uniform of law. It could speak in the neutral language of administration. It could claim with straight faces that it was protecting order while violating the most basic democratic principle, that citizens have the right to choose who governs them. And if you think this is merely historical, merely an artifact of a past era, ask yourself why the archives had to be fought open decades later. Ask yourself why names remained hidden. Ask yourself why the state that insisted it was defending Mississippi also insisted on secrecy. There is a reason institutions cling to silence. Silence preserves reputation. Silence preserves power. Silence protects careers and family names and local myths about how things really were. Silence turns victims into shadows, and shadows do not testify. So here is the line I want to draw at the end of this opening section. Freedom. Summer is not just a chapter in civil rights history. It is an anatomy lesson in how democratic participation becomes a target, and how the state, when aligned with an unjust social order, can use both violence and bureaucracy to enforce that order. The vote was treated like a contagion, and the people who carried it were treated like carriers. And when the nation finally looked, it looked through a window that had been smeared by purposeful fog. In the next section, we will separate the two stories, the way you separate blood from water, the official story that teaches pride, and the missing story that teaches vigilance. Because you do not honor the courage of 1964 by polishing it into inspiration, you honor it by naming what it stood against, precisely and without euphemism. A society that forgets the mechanisms of erasure will rebuild them without noticing. And that is why we have a responsibility, not to learn, not to explore, but to record, to insist on names, to count bodies, to refuse the comfort of sanitized narratives. If you're listening from Mississippi or from any place where the vote still comes with consequences, tell me where you are, not for engagement, for the record. They like to tell you Freedom Summer began with courage, as if courage is a spontaneous weather event, as if a few hundred young people simply woke up one morning and decided to challenge Mississippi. But nothing that threatens a system this entrenched begins with courage. It begins with planning, with procurement, with incentives, with the cold arithmetic of what a state will tolerate and what it will crush. In 1964, the civil rights movement in Mississippi had already been bleeding for years. Local black organizers had been doing the slow, thankless work that rarely makes it into textbooks, meeting in churches, walking roads that had no streetlights, naming registrars who lied, naming sheriffs who smiled while their deputies beat people in the back of a car. The summer didn't start the struggle. The summer escalated it. It brought a strategic decision into focus. If Mississippi could bury black suffering in local silence, then the movement would import witnesses. Visibility was not vanity. It was a shield, thin, inconsistent, and often too late, but still a shield. And that decision, bring in large numbers of out-of-state volunteers, was not romantic. It was tactical. It was made because the country had proven repeatedly that it could watch black citizens be punished for seeking basic rights and call it a local matter. The organizers understood the hierarchy of empathy in America, and they exploited it for survival. That fact should shame the nation, not the movement. It means the lives of local black Mississippians were not enough to force attention. It means suffering had to be packaged in a form the national press and federal power would be unable to ignore. So the project begins the way a serious operation begins, with coalition building, with assignments, with paperwork. You see it in the organizational structure, committees, schedules, volunteer intake, training sessions. You see it in the logistics, where people will sleep, how they will communicate, what to do if phones are cut, what legal teams are on call, what bail funds exist, how to document incidents without getting everyone killed. You see it in the discipline of messaging, how to explain to the country what Mississippi is without letting Mississippi define the terms. And then you see it in the first and most revealing procurement. Bodies, not in the grotesque sense, though the summer will drift toward that grotesque outcome, but in the administrative sense. They needed a workforce. They needed young people who could travel, who could be trained, who could endure fear, who could follow instructions, who could accept the possibility of arrest as part of the day. And the movement sourced that workforce through universities, churches, networks of activists. Some were teenagers, some were barely old enough to vote themselves. And Mississippi looked at that influx and did not interpret it as civic participation. Mississippi interpreted it as an invasion. Let's be precise about the incentives on both sides. The movement's incentive was to break the machinery of disenfranchisement by forcing national scrutiny and by building alternative power. Freedom schools, voter education, independent political organization. Mississippi's incentive was to keep black citizens politically inert, not because officials lacked imagination, but because the entire distribution of local power depended on it. Who held office? Who controlled sheriffs? Who controlled school boards? Who controlled courts? Who controlled jobs? Who controlled land? Political rights for black citizens meant a redistribution of authority that the existing system considered existential. So the response was not merely social hostility, it was counterinsurgency by another name: surveillance, infiltration, intimidation, strategic arrests, selective prosecution, tolerated violence, and above all the maintenance of plausible deniability. If the system could stop registration while still claiming law and order, it would. If it couldn't, it would let private terror do the job, and then pretend it had nothing to do with it. The aim was the same either way: make political participation feel like self-harm. Now, when leadership proposes what they believe is an elegant solution, pay attention to that phrase, because elegance in politics often means something ugly hidden beneath a clean surface. The elegant solution here was not violence, it was optics. It was a mass project designed to create national consequences for local brutality. If Mississippi harmed these volunteers, Mississippi would have to endure the glare. And the glare might force federal enforcement, or at least federal attention. That is the wager. But it is also a confession. It admits that local black Mississippians had been harmed for years without that glare arriving. The project did not invent Mississippi's cruelty. It exposed America's tolerance for it. The paper trail of this Project Begins phase is less sensational than the later violence, which is exactly why it matters, because it shows you that the summer was conceived in the language of administration, and Mississippi's resistance was also conducted in the language of administration. This is not a fairy tale of good people versus monsters. This is two bureaucracies colliding, one trying to expand citizenship, the other trying to restrict it. And when bureaucracies collide, they don't only fight with weapons, they fight with definitions, they fight with categories. They fight with who is allowed to be called legitimate and who is dismissed as outside. Mississippi officials, formal and informal, worked to frame the volunteers not as citizens supporting citizens, but as agitators manufacturing trouble. It's a classic strategy. When you can't defend your policy, attack the messenger. When you can't justify exclusion, claim the demand for inclusion is provocation. This is where you must stop thinking of the summer as a collection of heroic moments and start thinking of it as a contested supply chain. People, information, and money had to move. Mississippi's goal was to break those lines, cut communication, cut morale, cut legitimacy, cut bodies, and to do it in ways that would not trigger immediate federal takeover. That is the tightrope. Punish enough to deter, but not so visibly that Washington is forced to intervene decisively. That tightrope will snap at least once, and when it snaps, the nation will pretend it didn't know the rope existed. Now we move to the workforce itself, because this is where the language of erasure becomes concrete. Who did the work and how were they recorded? In the public memory, the workforce is often simplified into students and volunteers. It is a story with clean faces, photographed faces, names you can pronounce. But the deeper workforce, the one that made the summer possible and paid the price, was local Black Mississippians. They were not visitors. They could not leave when the summer ended. They were the ones whose landlords could evict them, the ones whose employers could fire them, the ones whose children could be threatened at school, the ones who would still be living next door to the sheriff's cousin after the headlines moved on. They were the ones for whom registering to vote was not an abstract ideal. It was a direct collision with the daily power structure. And here is the first prosecutorial point. Any account of Freedom Summer that centers the visiting volunteers while treating local Black organizers as background is repeating the logic of the system. It is another form of erasure, just dressed in admiration. So how does erasure show up in the record? It shows up in naming conventions. Volunteers are often recorded with full names, affiliations, hometowns, sometimes even biographical detail. They are legible. They are people. Local Black participants in hostile records are frequently reduced to categories: Negro male, Negro woman, applicant, local contact, tenant, domestic, or they are omitted entirely unless they become trouble. The records that belong to power treat the vulnerable as either invisible or as problems. This is not incidental. It is how a hierarchy maintains itself. It assigns individuality to the protected and anonymity to the disposable. And the movement's own records, while far more humane, still reflect the constraints of fear. You cannot always keep lists in a place where lists can be seized. You cannot always write down names in a world where a paper with names on it can become a death sentence. There is a tragic irony here. The very danger that made documentation necessary also made documentation lethal, so the archive becomes uneven, full where it is safe, sparse where it was most dangerous, and later, when historians come asking for proof, the gaps are misread as absence rather than as evidence of threat. In other words, the system's violence produces the very archival emptiness that later skeptics use to doubt the violence. That is how erasure perpetuates itself through time. The wound becomes the excuse. To humanize without sentimentalizing, we need micro-portraits, named individuals not as heroes, but as evidence. Evidence that this was not abstract. Evidence that the system confronted actual bodies. Consider the organizers whose names recur because they held the strategy together. People like Bob Moses, who approached Mississippi with the careful logic of someone who understood that every step could trigger retaliation. People like Fannie Lou Hamer, who did not speak in safe generalities because her body had already been used as a battleground. The names matter not because we need icons, but because icons can be replaced by myth. Names force specificity. Names force accountability. The moral demand of this story is not be inspired. The moral demand is do not let them vanish twice. Now consider the most haunting workforce dynamic, the deliberate contrast between the privileged and the disposable. Mississippi's defenders often reacted with special fury to the presence of white volunteers. Not because they cared about white safety. History proves they did not care when it served their objectives, but because the volunteers threatened the state's ability to keep its violence local. White bodies in the wrong place can turn local terror into national crisis. That was the fear. Meanwhile, Black bodies in the wrong place had already been treated as manageable. That's why the movement's strategy used visibility as leverage. And that's why the system's response often sought to separate people. Isolate local Black participants from outside allies, frighten local families into silence, paint outsiders as corrupting influences, and then punish locals for collaborating. The system understood coalition as a threat, It tried to make solidarity feel like contamination. The language of erasure also shows up in how records distinguish workers from citizens. A white volunteer in Mississippi could be described as a student or activist. A black Mississippian could be described as a laborer, a tenant, a domestic, even when they were performing the same political work. That is a subtle form of degradation. It drags a person back into an economic caste, away from political agency. It says, you are not a citizen asserting a right, you are a subject stepping out of place. And when institutions speak that way, violence becomes easier to justify because the victim has been linguistically demoted. Then there are the hints, the patterns that feel like shadows at the edge of the ledger. Sudden disappearances, replacements, unexplained gaps, people arrested, held, released, and then not heard from for days. Families that stop attending meetings because someone visited them at night. Freedom houses that are suddenly empty because threats escalated. Churches that become quiet because a bombing or an arson makes the building feel like a trap. When you read these patterns, you must resist the temptation to treat them as dramatic plot points. They are not twists. They are the statistical texture of living under a regime of intimidation. And intimidation has a workforce of its own. It is not only one group of masked men. It is the local deputy who chooses which side of the law is enforced. It is the registrar who makes the test impossible, then smiles. It is the judge who turns a petty charge into a warning. It is the employer who fires a worker for causing trouble. It is the landlord who evicts a family for politics. It is the citizen who provides names and license plates to the wrong people. It is the official who says, with a straight face, that the state is calm while the human archive screams. You do not need a singular villain. A system can distribute guilt so widely that no one feels responsible, while the outcome remains precise. Black political power suppressed again. So what do we learn from the workforce chapter of Freedom Summer? We learn that courage is not a personality trait. It is a social condition created when the cost of submission becomes unbearable. We learn that youth registering black voters is a phrase that hides the true structure. Local black communities carrying the risk, with youth volunteers used as amplifiers and lightning rods. We learn that the record itself is a battleground. Who gets named? Who gets numbered? Who gets categorized? Who gets erased? That is not mere documentation. That is power deciding whose life is legible. And here is the moral injunction that sits underneath this investigative tone, the part that sounds like preaching because it is. If you consume this story as entertainment, if you take the heroism and leave the mechanism, you become a collaborator with amnesia. The responsibility of memory is not to applaud, it is to account, to insist that the people most exposed to danger are not treated as extras in their own struggle. To insist that the bureaucratic language used to minimize violence is not repeated uncritically. To insist that names remain attached to what happened because systems that rely on erasure depend on your willingness to accept unknown as an endpoint. Freedom. Summer's second chapter is not a warm-up. It is the blueprint, a movement assembling a workforce under threat, and a state preparing to make that workforce pay. The third chapter is the warning. When the record starts sorting people into categories, citizen versus agitator, student versus troublemaker, applicant versus enemy, the violence is already halfway done. The body is often the final site of enforcement, but the first site is the file. The label, the story they tell about you before anything happens. And if you do not challenge that story, the rest follows with frightening ease. You want to understand Freedom Summer as horror, not as inspiration. Then stop starting with the speeches. Start with the conditions. Because a system of suppression doesn't only operate through dramatic violence, it operates through environment, through friction, through exhaustion, through the deliberate engineering of daily life so that courage becomes unsustainable. In Mississippi in 1964, the movement didn't walk into a neutral landscape and encounter hostility. It walked into a landscape already shaped, legally, economically, and socially, to punish black political action. That punishment had a routine. It had a calendar, it had a set of predictable tools, and the first tool was simply to make ordinary existence feel unsafe. Not only for the volunteers, for the local people who housed them, fed them, drove them, vouched for them, and then went back to their jobs where their bosses could punish them for what they dared to do at night. The day-to-day conditions were not hard in the cinematic sense. They were hard in the administrative sense. Everything required negotiation with risk. Where you slept was not a private detail, it was a vulnerability map. Freedom houses, church basements, spare rooms. These were practical solutions that also became targets. Food was not just food, it was logistics and exposure. Who goes to the store? Who gets seen buying supplies for those people? Which businesses will refuse service? Which businesses will provide service and then pay for it later? Tools were not just pencils and paper. They were lists of names, dangerous objects in a state where a list could become a hit parade. Phones were not just phones. They were lifelines that could be cut, monitored, or used to trace networks. Cars were not just cars. They were moving evidence, license plates that could be memorized, routes that could be predicted. If you want to hear the threat level without dramatics, listen to the fact that ordinary tasks, driving, shopping, sleeping, calling, had to be managed like operations. That is not normal civic life. That is a population living under pressure. And the pressure wasn't only from anonymous racists, it was from institutions that could make your life difficult without leaving a bruise that a camera could photograph. The registrar's office was a trap disguised as a public service. The courthouse was a place where procedure could be weaponized. The local jail was a revolving door designed to create fear, drain resources, and waste time. Arrests didn't have to lead to convictions to serve their purpose. They only had to interrupt, hold someone overnight, humiliate them, take their money, mark their name, teach the community a lesson. We can reach you any day we want, and we can do it while calling it law. The movement responded with its own discipline, schedules, check-ins, training about how to behave during arrests, how to document incidents without getting people killed. But discipline has limits when the environment is designed to punish it. A volunteer can leave Mississippi at the end of August. A local black family cannot. That asymmetry shaped everything. It meant local people carried the long-term risk while outsiders functioned as amplifiers and, sometimes, lightning rods. The system understood that too. It attacked the points of contact, landlords, employers, churches, schools, because that's where you can create consequences that outlast the summer. That is what makes the conditions chapter so revealing. You see suppression not as an event, but as an ecosystem. Sickness and safety were part of it, and I don't mean sickness only as medical. I mean the way constant fear becomes a public health condition. Sleep deprivation, hypervigilance, the stress of knowing that a knock on the door might not be a neighbor, and then the literal health risks. Overcrowded housing, summer heat, long travel, limited access to sympathetic medical care. The constant possibility that injuries won't be treated with dignity if the wrong institution gets control of the body. In a normal campaign, an injury is unfortunate. In Mississippi, an injury could become a vulnerability. You go to the wrong hospital, you get questioned. You report the wrong threat, you get arrested. You file the wrong complaint, you get targeted. The system created a grim logic. Silence felt safer than procedure. And when silence feels safer than procedure, the state has already won the first round. Discipline, yes, discipline, was enforced from both sides. On the movement's side, discipline meant nonviolent strategy, careful documentation, not escalating conflict, not giving local authorities pretexts. On the system's side, discipline meant coercion, the quiet enforcement of boundaries. Stay in your place. Don't talk to those people. Don't sign that form. Don't go to that meeting. And when coercion needed reinforcement, it arrived as warnings. Sometimes it arrived as a visit from law enforcement. Sometimes it arrived as an employer's ultimatum. Sometimes it arrived as a threat delivered by a man who didn't have to name his connections because everyone already knew. The point was not always to commit violence. The point was to make the threat of violence constant enough that violence didn't need to happen every time. That is efficient terror. That is terror as a budgeted expense. Now bring in the outsider witness, the voice that captures the environment not as politics but as lived texture. A volunteer writes home and describes how every drive is a calculation. Which county road, which time of day, which car behind them, which headlights appearing in the rearview mirror and not passing. A visiting minister notes that the churches aren't just spiritual centers, they're communications hubs under surveillance, meeting places where the simple act of gathering is treated as suspicious. A journalist arrives, hears the official statements about order, then sees the way black residents lower their voices when cars slow down near the sidewalk. A nurse hears people talk about accidents and falls the way people in controlled environments talk about injuries they cannot safely explain. These outsider voices matter because they demonstrate something prosecutorial. The fear was not internal. It was rational. It was produced by a system that made fear the sensible response. And then you get the first major incident, not the first injustice, but the first obvious escalation that forces even the indifferent to admit there is a pattern. It might be a bombing, it might be an arson, it might be a beating, it might be a coordinated sweep of arrests. The details vary by county, but the mechanism repeats: intimidation delivered as spectacle, followed by minimization delivered as paperwork. The record will call it unknown persons, or cause undetermined, or disturbance. The community will call it what it is: a warning, a reminder of who holds the monopoly on safety. And here is what you learn when you compare the human archive to the official archive. The official archive often begins after the event, when authorities decide it has become visible enough to require documentation. The human archive begins before the event, with the warnings and the rumors and the knowledge that something is coming. The official archive pretends events are isolated. The human archive knows they are connected. That is how cruelty can be presented without melodrama. You don't need to decorate it. The administrative language is already a confession if you know how to read it. When a report says a person was uncooperative, it may mean the person refused to be humiliated. When a report says an arrest was made to restore order, it may mean the arrest was made to punish political participation. When a report says outside agitators, it may mean citizens and allies attempted to challenge a system that was comfortable. When a report says investigation ongoing, it may mean no one intends to investigate. This is what I mean when I say the horror lives in paperwork. The state doesn't have to deny reality outright. It only has to describe it in a way that drains it of moral clarity. And once the conditions are set, once the environment is hostile by design, the next stage begins: the vanishings. Not the spectacular disappearances alone, though those will come. I'm talking first about the quiet ledger anomalies, the substitutions, the crossed-out names, the gaps in attendance, the people who are sent away, the people who were released and then never show up again. The record in Mississippi does not always say, "We made them disappear." It says things like moved, left the area, could not be located, failed to appear, no further information. Those phrases are not neutral. They are the vocabulary of a system that benefits from uncertainty. Uncertainty is not merely confusion, it is protection. If nothing is confirmed, nothing is prosecutable. If nothing is named, no one is responsible. Start with what the movement encountered repeatedly: arrests that functioned like a grinder. A person is picked up on a vague charge: traffic, disorderly conduct, investigation. They are held, questioned, released, sometimes late at night, sometimes far from safety. The official record will show an entry: booked, released. The human record will show the danger: who was waiting outside, who followed, who knew the person would be vulnerable at that specific moment. This is how a system can operate in daylight while outsourcing the final act to darkness. It provides the conditions, it provides the timing, it provides the cover. Then it shrugs and calls what follows unfortunate. And then there is the case that becomes the summer's signature because it exposes the machinery too clearly to deny. June 21st, 1964, Neshoba County. 3 civil rights workers: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. Goodman. The basic outline is well known, but I want you to hear it as a ledger story, not as a headline. The story includes an arrest and a release. Those are bureaucratic steps. Those are steps that can be logged, stamped, justified. And after the release, there is absence. Absence where an arrival should be. In a normal society, an arrest record and a disappearance would trigger suspicion of institutional involvement. In Mississippi, suspicion was treated as insolence. The system's first instinct was not urgency, it was control. Control of narrative, control of jurisdiction, control of what could be said publicly. And the longer the men were missing, the more the case became something else. Not just 3 lives in danger, but a contest over who would be allowed to define reality. Here is the part that should freeze you if you are listening honestly. The disappearance does not read like an accident. It reads like a sequence, a stop, a hold, a release into a landscape where people who wanted them dead had time and opportunity. The vanishing is not magic. It is coordination. It is a community structure that can make 3 people disappear and then keep the story muddy long enough for denial to breathe. You cannot do that with random hatred alone. You do it with networks, with confidence, with the belief, earned by experience, that accountability will not arrive quickly if it arrives at all. And when the bodies are found, concealed, buried, another ledger appears. Not only the ledger of who died, but the ledger of how the state will respond. What charges will be pursued by whom and when? What will be framed as a local crime rather than a political act? What will be argued as not enough evidence rather than unwillingness? What will be postponed until memory weakens and witnesses age and the public moves on? Delay is a tactic. It doesn't need to be announced. It works silently, like rot. And it produces a second vanishing, the vanishing of urgency, the vanishing of consequence. But don't make the mistake of thinking the vanishings are only about those 3 men. They are not. The vanishings include the local people whose names are harder to find in mainstream memory because their suffering did not trigger national outrage. The vanishings include the people who stopped coming to meetings because they were threatened. The vanishings include the families who had to relocate quietly. The vanishings include the stories that never became cases. The human archive holds these in fragments. A whispered account, a diary entry, a church elder remembering a name that no one wrote down because writing it down felt dangerous. And this is where the investigative posture becomes moral, because you can't claim to honor Freedom Summer if you only honor what became visible. If you only honor what the nation was willing to see. The buried record is not less true because it is less famous. It is less famous because the system succeeded. Now look closely at the ledger behavior, substitutions, and crossed out lines. When intimidation works, people disappear from public action without a body count. That is the system's preferred outcome. It wants compliance without evidence. It wants fear without proof. So you see patterns: a local contact suddenly unavailable, a freedom school teacher quietly replaced, a host family no longer hosting, a meeting location moved, then moved again, then canceled. Officially, these are logistical changes. In reality, they are injuries. Each change tells you the system has applied pressure somewhere, and the movement has had to adapt to survive. This is not a tale of smooth strategy. It is a tale of constant triage. And then there are the phrases that function like trapdoors in the record. Sent away for care. Taken to another county. Removed for questioning. Could not be located. These phrases appear in many oppression contexts because they are useful. They are vague enough to avoid accountability and specific enough to end a conversation. They are the bureaucratic version of don't ask. When you hear them, you should hear the danger question forming underneath. Where did they go? Who last had custody? Who benefited from the uncertainty? The narrator's job here is not to speculate wildly. It is to insist that these questions are not rude. They are necessary. They are what a functioning moral society demands. So this is the hinge between conditions and vanishings. Mississippi's suppression did not rely exclusively on dramatic violence. It relied on creating an environment where disappearance, social, political, sometimes literal, could occur with minimal paperwork and maximum fear. The state and its allies did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to make enough examples, apply enough pressure, and then record the aftermath in a language that made it sound like nothing had happened. That is why the movement's greatest enemy was not only the night rider or the bomber or the deputy with a grudge. It was also the quiet sentence in a report that reduced human terror to a disturbance, and the quiet decision not to investigate, and the quiet social agreement that black citizens seeking the vote deserved what happened to them. If you want a moral lesson that isn't cheap, take this. Memory is not passive. Memory is a duty. When a system uses vagueness as a shield, your responsibility is precision. When it uses silence as policy, your responsibility is testimony. When it treats people as replaceable entries, your responsibility is to insist on names and continuity. Freedom. Summer is often framed as a heroic push that helped change federal law and national consciousness. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that many of the summer's wounds were designed to be uncountable, designed to be deniable, designed to fade. And if you allow them to fade, you are not neutral. You are assisting the very mechanism this story is accusing, the mechanism of erasure. By July 1964, Mississippi is no longer pretending this is a registration drive. The summer has a different temperature now, one you can measure not only by heat but by volume. The volume of threats, the volume of arrests, the volume of fires, the volume of funerals, the volume of meetings held with someone posted at the window to watch the road. This is the crisis summer, the peak event window, the stretch of weeks when everything accelerates and the system reveals what it has always been capable of. If you want to understand how suppression works, don't focus on the single spectacular crime that makes national news. Focus on the density. Suppression becomes most effective when it stops looking like isolated incidents and starts looking like a climate, when terror is frequent enough to feel normal and normal enough to feel unavoidable. In Mississippi, the goal was not merely to hurt people. The goal was to make the act of registering black voters feel like walking into a furnace every day, until the community itself concludes that survival requires retreat. That is how systems win without having to kill everyone. They create a landscape where courage becomes too expensive for most people most of the time. The crisis is not abstract. It has a calendar. June 21, 1964, 3 workers vanish in Neshoba County. After that date, the state can no longer claim ignorance. The country can no longer claim this is merely local tension. But what happens next is not a clean intervention. It is a collision of pressures. Federal attention increases, yes. Cameras arrive, yes. National organizations focus, yes. And still, the violence continues. That is the prosecutorial fact that should disturb you. Visibility does not stop the machine. Sometimes it merely changes how the machine presents itself. Sometimes it changes the wording in the report. Sometimes it forces the state to outsource the bluntest actions while keeping the same outcome. There is a reason you hear about bombings and beatings and church burnings in this period. The perpetrators understood symbolism. They understood that churches were not only spiritual spaces, they were organizing infrastructure. They understood that freedom schools were not only classrooms, they were factories of political literacy. They understood that intimidation did not need to be subtle when local institutions were friendly and witnesses were scared. The violence was both practical and communicative. It said, "We can reach you anywhere, and we can do it again." Now, hear the record the way it accumulates when a season turns into an assault campaign. You see reports of assaults, reports of shots fired, reports of arson, reports of bombings. You see arrests stacked like sandbags, people picked up for disturbances, for traffic violations, for refusing to disperse, for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you see something else, requests for replacements, letters and calls and messages, formal and informal, asking for more workers, more volunteers, more bodies to fill gaps created by fear and injury and incarceration. The paper trail of a crisis always includes replacement language. It is the administrative confession that the existing workforce is being consumed. In war, you call it attrition. In Mississippi, in 1964, it was attrition dressed as law and order. This is where you must resist the temptation to treat the movement as a single unified body marching forward. In reality, it is a network under siege. It is people trying to keep schedules while responding to emergencies. It is organizers doing political work while also doing survival work. It is families deciding, every week, whether they can continue to host meetings without losing their homes. It is local people weighing the risk of going to the courthouse against the risk of not going and staying politically invisible. The system exploited these calculations. It did not need perfect control. It only needed enough fear to disrupt momentum. Because political projects rely on continuity, and intimidation is a continuity killer. Every arrest breaks a routine. Every threat fractures a plan. Every fire forces a relocation. Every beating drains time into recovery and funerals and fear management. This is how the crisis summer functions as policy. It converts civic participation into chaos, then points at the chaos and calls it justification for crackdowns. And there is another layer to the peak window that rarely gets discussed in polite retellings: restricted spaces. Every suppression regime has them, places where things happen that are not meant to be described. A back room at a jail, a separate holding area, an unofficial interrogation space, a place where the rules loosen because the public cannot see. You will not always find these spaces neatly labeled in official paperwork. You find them in the way stories repeat. They took him somewhere else. They held her in a different room. They moved them out back. We couldn't find where they were taken. Those are not just anecdotes, they are pattern indicators. When a system wants to punish without leaving clean evidence, it uses spaces that are hard to document and easy to deny. A courthouse can be a stage. A jail can also be a labyrinth. And in Mississippi, the labyrinth mattered. It created the conditions in which people could be separated, intimidated, humiliated, and then released into vulnerability. The official record captures booked and released. The human archive remembers what happened between those words. This is the point where my voice has to change from careful inference to blunt accusation, because there are moments when the record stops allowing neutrality. If a movement worker is arrested, released at night, and then disappears, and the community knows law enforcement was involved in the sequence, we are no longer discussing random violence. We are discussing a system in which custody and vulnerability are managed. We are discussing a chain of events that resembles coordination. You can argue about how explicit that coordination was. You can argue about who signed what order. But the outcome remains. The law's procedures were used as part of the harm. And if you sanitize that into tensions ran high, you are not being balanced. You are being complicit. In the crisis window, the movement also pushes harder because the cost of stopping becomes moral disaster. This is where freedom schools expand, where voter education continues despite the pressure, where organizing becomes both political and psychological, keeping people from collapsing into silence. The system counts on fatigue. It counts on the human need for peace. It counts on the fact that most people cannot live indefinitely in a state of threat. So the movement tries to build community resilience, tries to create meaning and discipline, tries to turn fear into collective action rather than private retreat. But fear is not just an emotion here. Fear is an input into decision-making, and Mississippi supplied it like a resource. Now we move to the next phase, the confrontation letters, the moments when people with leverage demand answers. This is where the record becomes especially revealing because institutions confess more when pressured by other institutions. You want proof of how the system operated? Watch how it behaves when someone powerful makes a demand. The people with leverage in this story are not only civil rights leaders, they are families. They are universities whose students are now missing or arrested. They are churches and donors. They are national journalists and editors. They are lawyers. They are insurers and funders who suddenly realize that risk is not theoretical. They are political party officials who fear embarrassment. And, crucially, they are federal actors forced into motion by national attention. These are the entities that can compel paperwork, compel statements, compel responses. And what happens when leverage is applied is a lesson. The institution responds quickly, defensively, and vaguely. Vague is not an accident. Vague is strategy. Vague is how you acknowledge pressure without admitting liability. This is where the demanding letter becomes a structural element, even if you don't hold the physical paper in your hand. It has a recognizable shape. Return them, or prove where they are. Produce them, or explain custody. Provide names, provide times, provide locations, provide who authorized what. And the response, from local authorities or aligned institutions, also has a recognizable shape. Denial, deflection, procedural language, and when necessary, minimal admission without detail. We have no knowledge. They were released. They left the area. We are investigating. We are cooperating. It is the language of self-protection, and it tells you something that should not be forgotten. Admission tends to occur only under pressure, otherwise the default is silence. Default. Why does pressure matter? Because it reveals the hierarchy of whose questions are allowed. Local black families could demand answers for years and be ignored or threatened. But when a question arrives backed by national attention, money, political influence, or federal power, the system's posture changes. Not because it has suddenly found conscience, because it senses risk. And that hierarchy, whose demands generate paperwork and whose demands generate violence, is the moral indictment at the heart of this story. A democracy that responds to some citizens with procedure and others with intimidation is not malfunctioning. It is functioning as designed. In the confrontation phase, you also see how institutions attempt to control the narrative by controlling the category of the victim. If the missing person can be labeled a drifter, an agitator, a troublemaker, then their disappearance can be framed as consequence rather than crime. If the movement can be framed as outsiders stirring up trouble, then violence becomes unfortunate but understandable. This is not merely propaganda, it is the groundwork for non-investigation. Because the fastest way to prevent accountability is to imply the victim is responsible for the harm. That is why the term outside agitator is more than an insult. It is a legal and social tool. It tries to strip a person of moral claim. It tries to make the community feel less obligated to care. And the movement's strategic vulnerability, importing witnesses from outside, also becomes the system's rhetorical weapon. The same fact that produces national attention also produces the accusation of illegitimacy. This is how suppression adapts. It turns your tactic into your supposed crime. When the confrontation letters and demands arrive, the institution's response often includes one key feature. It admits only what it cannot plausibly deny, and it provides no usable detail. It may concede a death without explaining circumstances. It may concede a release without naming who authorized it. It may concede a dispute without describing violence. This is the minimal admission technique, and it is not unique to Mississippi. It is how bureaucracies avoid liability. But in this context, it has a moral consequence. It turns human loss into an administrative inconvenience. It reduces terror to a line item. It attempts to close the case without opening the truth. And you can see the same mechanism at work when families demand the return of their children, when local communities demand protection, when civil rights organizations demand federal intervention. Every demand is met with a mix of posture and delay. Delay is not just time passing. Delay is a tactic that drains energy from the demanding party. It forces them to repeat themselves. It forces them to spend money. It forces them to keep traveling. It forces them to remain exposed. It forces them to choose between pursuing justice and preserving their own safety. Delay makes people tired, and tired people stop asking. That is the quiet hope of every institution trying to avoid accountability, that you will run out of time, or money, or courage, or breath. By late July and August, the summer feels like it is being conducted under two clocks. One clock is the movement's clock. Deadlines, voter registration attempts, freedom school sessions, meetings, the attempt to build a political challenge that will outlast the summer. The other clock is the system's clock. The clock of intimidation, the clock of arrests, the clock of retaliatory violence timed to disrupt gatherings and punish visible action. The second clock is designed to dominate the first. It is designed to make planning impossible, and yet the movement continues, which is its own indictment of the system. Because if the system were truly legitimate, it would not need this level of coercion to maintain itself. A legitimate order does not fear paper and pens and citizens asking to vote. Only an illegitimate order fears that. So what do we establish in this peak window and confrontation phase? We establish that violence spiked not as a chaotic accident, but as a predictable response to a predictable threat. Black political participation. We established that intimidation functioned like infrastructure. We established that institutional responses were calibrated for deniability, not truth. And we establish a moral pattern. The system speaks most clearly when pressured by other power. It is not moved by suffering, it is moved by risk. Here is the sermon-like part, because it has to be said plainly. If you consume Freedom Summer as a story of brave youth and tragic violence, and you stop there, you have learned nothing that will protect anyone now. The point is not to feel admiration. The point is to recognize mechanisms. Mechanisms repeat. The language changes. The uniforms change. The technology changes. But the logic remains. Make participation costly. Label challengers as illegitimate. Use procedure to harass. Use vagueness to deny and respond with detail only when forced by leverage. That is the machinery of suppression. And your responsibility, as a listener, as a citizen, as someone benefiting from rights that others paid for, is to refuse the comfort of vague retellings. Demand specificity, demand names, demand timelines, demand custody chains, demand to know who authorized what and why. Because silence is not neutral, silence is policy, and when you allow the policy to stand, you inherit its consequences. So when you hear Freedom Summer, don't only picture a classroom or a clipboard, picture the peak window, the density of harm, the administrative grind, the climate of threat. And picture the confrontation letters, the moments when power demanded answers and received carefully measured fog. That fog is part of the crime. It is not a footnote. It is the method by which crimes survive into history as controversy instead of accountability. If we are serious about memory, we do not let fog become the official weather report. We write down what happened, we insist on what can be proven, and we refuse to pretend that vagueness is the same as truth. The most dangerous myth about Mississippi in 1964 is the myth of the lone villain. The myth says, there were bad men, extremists, hooded figures, and everyone else was merely caught in the times. That myth is comfortable because it lets institutions wash their hands. It turns a system into a mood. It turns policy into prejudice. It turns paperwork into background noise. But if you read the buried record correctly, you see something colder and more durable, a cover-up mechanism that does not require a mastermind, only a shared incentive, a shared understanding that certain lives are expendable, and that the reputation of the local order is worth more than the truth. In that mechanism, silence isn't just the absence of speech. Silence is a procedure. It has steps, it has tools, it has a chain of custody the same way evidence does. And it functions like a second burial. After the first burial in the earth, there is a burial in language. Start with the euphemisms, because euphemisms are the first layer of institutional armor. Mississippi didn't have to deny that violence happened. It only had to describe it as if it were random, inevitable, and unconnected to power. Bombings become incidents, beatings become disturbances, threats become complaints, arrests become restoring order. If you want to hide intent, you hide it in vocabulary. You strip the action of motive and replace motive with fog. You make it sound like weather. Unfortunate, sudden, nobody's fault. And then you add the magic phrase that turns accountability into a hallway with no doors. Unknown persons. Unknown persons did the bombing. Unknown persons fired the shots. Unknown persons burned the church. Unknown persons threatened the family. The community knows exactly which unknown persons those were, but the official record pretends ignorance. That pretense is not a failure of intelligence. It is a choice. It is a kind of legal fiction maintained so the system can keep functioning without indicting itself. Then come the classified annexes, formal or informal. In some contexts, classified means a stamped document locked away. In Mississippi's world, classified often means something simpler, a report that never gets written in the first place, a detail kept out of the official log, a name spoken quietly rather than recorded, a phone call instead of a memo, an instruction delivered as a nod. This is how a cover-up can be conducted without a single dramatic moment of shredding. You simply keep the most damaging information from becoming record, and the people involved don't have to think of themselves as conspirators. They can think of themselves as protecting the community, preventing unrest, keeping order. They can believe they are doing their jobs. That is the banality that makes it effective. Cover-ups work best when participants can describe their actions as routine. Now look at the missing pages, the lost logbooks, the "we can't locate that file," the absence that appears in the archive like a cleanly torn edge. This is where the horror becomes archival, because missing pages are not neutral. Missing pages are evidence. If a jail log omits a detail, if a report ends abruptly, if a chain of events is documented up to the moment where accountability would crystallize, and then the paper goes silent, you are looking at the outline of a decision. You are looking at the moment someone chose not to record, or chose to remove, or chose to misfile. People love to treat missing records as an annoyance for historians. In this story, missing records are the crime scene tape. They tell you where the truth became dangerous. Next tool, restricted handling of bodies and burial. In any system that relies on intimidation, bodies are not just tragedies, they are messages, and messages are managed. You control who sees the body, who documents the wounds, who speaks at the funeral, who is allowed to claim the death publicly. You frame it as accident, or personal dispute, or unfortunate event. You control the public narrative so that a political killing can be treated as private misfortune. The point is not only to kill, it is to prevent the killing from becoming a political fact. Because political facts attract political consequences, and Mississippi in 1964, in many counties, lived on the assumption that it could avoid consequences long enough for fear to do its work. Then you have non-disclosure orders, formal and informal again. Not every silence comes with a signed document. Sometimes silence is enforced socially. Don't talk to the press. Don't tell the FBI. Don't bring trouble on the family. Sometimes it's enforced economically. Job loss, eviction, denial of credit, harassment. Sometimes it's enforced physically, but the effect is the same. Witnesses learn that telling the truth is a risk, while not telling it is merely shame. A system that can make truth feel more dangerous than lies has achieved a kind of control that does not require constant violence. It can run on fear alone. And finally, the operational trick that ties it together. Move the work to a different site, a different jurisdiction, a different administrative category. If a county becomes too hot, push action into the next county. If scrutiny increases, let private citizens do the dirty work while officials maintain plausible distance. If a police department is suspected, let another agency handle the next step. Fragment the chain so no single node appears responsible, even though the network as a whole produces the outcome. That is not improvisation. That is a known method of institutional self-protection. It is how systems preserve themselves under scrutiny. They distribute guilt so widely that it becomes hard to prosecute, and they keep the paperwork just clean enough that denial can survive. This is what I mean when I say silence as procedure. Procedure is not only what a government writes into law, it is what it reliably does. If you can predict the institutional response, minimize, deny, delay, deflect, omit, you are not watching chaos. You are watching procedure. Now we jump. Because buried records have a second life. 30, 40, 50 years pass, and the ground shifts, not only literally, but politically. A building is renovated, a file is reopened, a lawsuit forces disclosure, a cold case is revived, a journalist asks again, a researcher finds a box no one cataloged, and the second discovery occurs. Not in 1964, but later, when institutions are old enough to think their secrets have become harmless, and when surviving witnesses are tired enough to be ignored. This is the part of the story that should destroy your faith in closure, because the second discovery proves that the same choice can repeat across generations: reveal and reckon, or rebury and move on. Too often, the choice is rebury. In Mississippi, one of the clearest examples of that second discovery is not a bone in the dirt, but a record in a vault: the Sovereignty Commission files. The state created an agency to monitor and undermine civil rights, and for years those files were sealed. When they were forced open after litigation in the late 20th century, the public learned what many had suspected but could not prove in official terms. The state's involvement in surveillance and resistance was not rumor. It was documented. Names, dates, contacts. The human archive had been right. And yet, notice the pattern. Opening the files did not instantly produce accountability. It produced knowledge, which is not the same as justice. Knowledge can be absorbed and then neutralized. It can be treated as history, safely passed, rather than as an indictment of institutional behavior that persists in new forms. But the second discovery isn't only about state surveillance files. It is also about the physical case that anchored the summer's national attention: the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Decades later, the case re-enters the courtroom. Not because time naturally brings truth, because pressure returns, because people refuse to let the file die. In 2005, Edgar Ray Killen is convicted, not of murder, but of manslaughter, in connection with the 1964 killings. Let that sink in as a lesson in institutional time. 41 years. More than a generation. The men died in 1964. The conviction arrives in 2005. This is not simply slow justice. This is justice rationed by delay. It is accountability negotiated down by time. Witnesses die, memories fade, evidence degrades. The system that benefited from violence gets to age into innocence because decades can make atrocity feel like another era, and another era can be treated as less urgent. Now here is the uncomfortable question. When a case is reopened decades later, what exactly is being discovered? Sometimes it is new evidence. Sometimes it is a new willingness to prosecute. Often it is not that the truth was unavailable. It is that the truth was inconvenient. The second discovery reveals not only what happened but what was refused. It reveals the shape of the earlier cover-up. It shows you the gap between knowledge and action. And that gap, between what was known and what was done, is where moral responsibility lives. The second discovery also reveals the continuity of procedure. In 1964, the procedure was intimidate, minimize, deny, delay. In later decades, the procedure becomes archive, seal, litigate, release selectively, prosecute minimally, declare closure. Different verbs, same instinct, control the damage to the institution. Even when the files are opened, even when the conviction is secured, the system tries to narrow the narrative so it becomes manageable. One man convicted, one case resolved, a bad chapter closed. But the mechanism that made the chapter possible, the network of complicity, the normalization of intimidation, the bureaucratic minimization, does not get convicted. Mechanisms rarely do. That is why this story must be told in a prosecutorial tone. Because if you treat it as tragedy, without assignment of responsibility, You allow the mechanism to survive with its reputation intact. And this is where the horror becomes moral rather than sensational. The reburial can happen in full daylight. A community can acknowledge mistakes were made and still avoid naming who made them, who benefited, who enforced them. An institution can release documents and still keep key pages missing. A state can allow a database of records and still leave the human consequences unaddressed. A courtroom can deliver a verdict and still leave the broader truth untouched. Closure can be a form of erasure when it is used to end questions rather than answer them. So what do we do with this? We do the thing the cover-up procedure is designed to prevent. We connect the fragments. We treat euphemisms as evidence of intent. We treat missing pages as the outline of decisions. We treat delayed prosecutions as proof of institutional reluctance, not simply time passing. We treat second discoveries not as comforting revelations that history eventually comes out, but as indictments of how long systems can hide in plain sight. And I need to say this plainly because it is the moral spine of this segment. The record is not sacred by default. Official archives are not neutral by default. They are produced by power. And power, in Mississippi in 1964 and in many places since, has a consistent habit. It documents what serves it and omits what condemns it. That means your responsibility as a listener is not to accept records as truth simply because they are typed and stamped. Your responsibility is to interrogate the shape of the record, what is emphasized, what is minimized, what is missing, and why. Because the cover-up mechanism depends on your laziness. It depends on your willingness to treat official silence as proof that nothing happened. It depends on your willingness to accept closure without accounting. The second discovery, whether it is a sealed archive forced open or a case revived decades later, offers one gift and one warning. The gift is that the human archive can be validated, sometimes. The warning is that validation is not guaranteed, and it often arrives too late for the dead. That is why memory must not wait for permission. That is why recording is a duty, not a hobby. Because in a system that practices silence as procedure, the truth does not simply come out. It is dragged out piece by people who refuse to be trained into forgetting. So when you hear about files opened in the late 20th century, when you hear about a conviction in 2005 for a crime in 1964, do not interpret that as a happy ending. Interpret it as evidence of resistance against erasure. Interpret it as proof that the cover-up mechanism can be challenged, but also as proof of how long the mechanism can hold. And then ask the question that scares institutions the most. The question that turns history into accountability. If it took decades to admit what was already known, what else has been sealed, misfiled, lost, or politely reburied in our own time under cleaner language and newer excuses? There is a moment in every buried record story when the institution realizes the threat is no longer the activist on the street. The threat is the person with boxes. The threat is the person who knows how to read paper the way a coroner reads bone. Because a movement can be beaten back in a summer, but a private archive can outlive the men who built the system, and that is why the next phase of Freedom Summer is not only about what happened in 1964. It is about what survived after 1964, what was carried, copied, hidden, rewritten, and quietly protected from the official story. The system that practiced silence as procedure did not only use violence to suppress votes, it used bureaucracy to suppress memory. So the counterattack was not only marches and registration drives, it was preservation, it was testimony, it was the stubborn refusal to let events dissolve into controversy and complexity and both sides. It was the creation of a second archive that could not be controlled by the county courthouse. The private archive begins as fragments because fragments are what terror allows. In Mississippi in 1964, you don't build a neat folder labeled Evidence of State Complicity. You build a stash, you keep a letter in a Bible, you tuck a list into a false bottom of a drawer, you memorize names because paper can be seized, you copy addresses because phones can be cut, you write in code because a plain sentence can be used against you, you tell your story to a trusted person because the police report will become a trap. The private archive is first a survival technique. It is the human instinct to keep a record when the official record is hostile. And once the summer ends, the private archive becomes something else. The only bridge between what happened and what can be proven later, when witnesses are older and institutions are pretending innocence. This is where the historian figure enters. Not necessarily a single person with a famous name, but the type. Someone who collects what the institution discards. Someone who does not accept lost as a final answer. Someone who understands that silence is not empty, it is shaped. The historian compiles oral histories, interviews, side notes, church minutes, volunteer diaries, clippings, legal briefs, scraps of correspondence, photographs with dates penciled on the back. The historian notices the repeated patterns the way an investigator notices repeated wounds. The same counties, the same officers, the same phrases, the same unknown persons, the same convenient gaps. And then the historian tries to publish, tries to formalize, tries to move the human archive into the realm of the official, because publication is a way of forcing memory into public space where it can't be quietly buried again. This is where the institutional pushback becomes explicit. It doesn't always arrive as a threat. Sometimes it arrives as professionalism, as funding decisions, as access decisions, as editorial standards, as the kind of polite pressure that can destroy truth without leaving fingerprints. Remove that section, or the project loses support. Remove those names, or the archive will remain closed. Tone it down, or we can't guarantee cooperation. Reframe it as community tensions, rather than targeted suppression, if you want the doors to open. This is how institutions launder themselves through gatekeeping. They demand that you minimize them as the price of being heard. And if you think that's ancient history, understand this. The most effective censorship in democratic societies is not the dramatic banning of books. It is the quiet conditioning of what is publishable, fundable, respectable, balanced. It is the forced trade. You can have access or you can have honesty, but not both. Now bring it back to 1964, to the moment when the private archive becomes political dynamite. Atlantic City, August 1964. The Democratic National Convention. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, arrives to challenge the legitimacy of the state's all-white delegation. This isn't a symbolic protest. It's a direct assault on the mechanism of disenfranchisement. The MFDP is the human archive walking into the nation's party machinery and saying, the official story you accept about Mississippi is a lie. You cannot seat representatives chosen through terror and exclusion and then pretend you are the party of democratic legitimacy. The challenge forces a choice. Either confront the reality of Mississippi's suppression or negotiate around it to preserve party unity and electoral strategy. And when institutions face choices like that, they tend to protect themselves first. The private archive becomes public when Fannie Lou Hamer testifies. Her voice is not theoretical, it is not academic. It is the voice of someone whose body has been used as enforcement. She describes the cost of trying to register, the cost of refusing silence, and in that moment, you can watch the cover-up mechanism attempt to operate in real time, not by disproving her, because they can't, but by managing exposure, by trying to keep her testimony from dominating the narrative, by shifting attention, by negotiating, by offering a compromise that sounds reasonable if you ignore the brutality that made the challenge necessary. That is the hinge. Truth exists, spoken clearly. And the institution responds not with moral clarity, but with political calculus. This is not merely disappointing, it is instructive. It shows you that even when the record is made public, power will try to dilute it. And what does dilution look like? It looks like the reduction of structural suppression into a problem of optics. It looks like a compromise offer that treats disenfranchised citizens as bargaining chips rather than rightful participants. It looks like language that honors concerns while refusing accountability. It looks like a national party that can praise civil rights in abstract while negotiating away the people who paid for those rights with bruises and blood. If you want the dark documentary version of this moment, here it is. Atlantic City is the place where the human archive demanded admission into the official archive, and the institution tried to accept it only in a form that would not disrupt the existing hierarchy. It tried to let the truth speak, as long as the truth did not change anything. That failure produces the private archive's next stage, the saved pages, the unpublished manuscript, the deleted chapter kept in a box, the researcher who capitulates in public and preserves in private. Because the truth isn't always defeated by being disproven, it is defeated by being scattered, exhausted, and postponed. The private archive becomes the tragic hinge because it holds what the public narrative refuses to integrate. It holds names, it holds dates, it holds the connective tissue that turns incidents into a mechanism, and the institution's instinct is to keep that connective tissue from becoming widely legible. Now step into the modern era, the phase where the system learns new language but keeps the same habit. The modern technical report doesn't always arrive as a single-bound document labeled, "We recommend against excavation." Sometimes it arrives as databases, scans, audits, and declassifications. A digitized set of files. A government web page summarizing a case in sanitized chronology, a sealed archive opened by court order with redactions that function like black bars across memory. A case closed stamp applied not because the truth is known, but because the institution is tired of being asked. Modernity does not kill the cover-up mechanism. It refines it, it upgrades it, it gives it better formatting. Look at what happens when state surveillance records become searchable. When an agency's files, once sealed, are opened decades later, the public is told, transparency has arrived. But transparency is not the same as accountability. You can release documents and still preserve the institution by controlling interpretation. By releasing without context. By releasing in a volume so large that the average person can't process it. By redacting names so networks remain fuzzy. By claiming privacy for perpetrators while denying privacy to victims. By treating the revelations as historical interest rather than evidence of systematic wrongdoing. The modern technical report version of a cover-up is often an information dump without moral framing. It's the perfect camouflage. Everything is available, therefore nothing is urgent. And then there is the modern scan, the way technology turns absence into visible anomaly. When files are digitized, you begin to notice patterns at scale. Repeated phrasing across counties, the same euphemisms copied like templates, the same explanation used to dismiss different complaints, the same gaps occurring where names should be, the same types of incidents investigated without resolution. Technology can reveal repetition, and repetition is the fingerprint of procedure. This is where the narrator's voice must become blunt again. If the same kinds of violence occur, and the same kinds of minimization follow, and the same kinds of non-prosecution persist, you are not looking at misfortune. You are looking at institutional behavior. But here's the modern twist. The technical report tone is designed to sound neutral. It uses words like alleged, reported, claimed, context, complicated. It reduces moral asymmetry into administrative symmetry. It describes intimidation as if it were disagreement. It describes disenfranchisement as if it were bureaucratic error. This is not just style, it is strategy. Neutral tone can be a weapon when it is applied to unequal violence. Because neutral tone can make the listener feel that outrage is unprofessional, that moral clarity is biased, that naming perpetrators is inflammatory. Modern institutions are very good at training people to equate calm language with truth. But calm language can be a method of erasure. In the modern era, you will also encounter recommendations against reopening, against disturbing old sites, old cases, old accusations. Not always stated as, do not excavate, but implied, there is insufficient evidence, witnesses are deceased, records are incomplete, prosecution is unlikely, reopening would inflame tensions, resources are limited, we should focus on the future. Listen carefully to that cluster of excuses. Some of it sounds reasonable. That is the point. Cover-up mechanisms mature by learning to speak like responsible management. They learn to frame moral duty as impractical. They learn to present forgetting as civic hygiene. But if you accept that framing, you accept the premise that the institution's convenience outranks the victim's truth. Here is the continuity that matters. In 1964, the system tried to prevent records from being created. In later decades, it tried to control the conditions under which records could be accessed. In the modern era, it often tries to control interpretation by burying clarity under volume, redaction, and tone. The effect is the same. The public is allowed to know just enough to feel informed, but not enough to feel obligated. That is how democracies can absorb atrocity without changing. They convert it into history, which is another word for something you can feel sad about without doing anything. So what does a modern technical report reveal if you read it as dark document rather than public relations? It reveals continuity of decision. It reveals that the record remains incomplete not by accident but by design. It reveals that institutions still prefer to minimize reputational damage rather than maximize truth. It reveals that recommendations often function as moral vetoes. Don't dig, don't reopen, don't name, don't connect. And when you translate that into plain language, the recommendation is often, let the dead stay quiet, because their quiet is useful. Now I want to press the point that is easiest to avoid. The private archive is not just a collection of memorabilia, it is an indictment of the official archive's failure. Every diary entry kept in secret is proof that public reporting was unsafe. Every oral testimony recorded years later is proof that speaking earlier carried risk. Every missing page in the official file is proof of a choice. Every redaction is proof that someone still believes secrecy serves a purpose. The private archive exists because the institution did not do its job. And the modern technical report exists because the institution wants to appear to do its job without surrendering control. This is why memory becomes duty here, not preference. If you only celebrate Freedom Summer as heroism, you help the mechanism that survived it. If you only mourn the dead and praise the brave, you let the bureaucratic language keep its victory, turning organized suppression into a turbulent time. The responsibility is heavier than that. The responsibility is to keep the connective tissue intact, names, dates, procedures, incentives, to refuse the dilution, to refuse the compromise that requires silence, to treat the private archive not as anecdote but as evidence, and to treat modern, neutral summaries with suspicion when they flatten moral reality into administrative calm. Because here is the final truth of this segment. The system didn't only fight votes. It fought narrative. It fought legibility. It fought the creation of a record that could prosecute it later. And it fought so effectively that even decades after 1964, the public still debates what was proven, as if the absence of perfect paperwork is proof of innocence rather than proof of intimidation. That is the long shadow of silence as procedure. It doesn't end when the summer ends. It becomes part of the archive itself. And if you want to honor the people who risked everything in 1964, you do not honor them with vague admiration. You honor them with exactness. You honor them by refusing to let their testimony be negotiated down again. You honor them by treating every redaction, every missing page, every delayed admission as what it really is. A continuation of the same old choice. Protect the institution and let the human cost remain uncounted. We are at the point in this story where comforting language becomes a form of theft. People want endings, they want closure, they want Freedom Summer to resolve into a clean moral. Brave youth arrived, the nation watched, change happened, the bad men lost, but that ending is the kind an institution prefers because it turns a mechanism into a moment. It turns procedure into folklore. It lets the living inherit rights without inheriting responsibility. So here is what we will do instead. In the spirit of a dark document, we will separate what we can prove from what we can infer, and we will name the unknowns as unknowns. Unknown not because the truth is mystical, but because choices were made to keep it that way. And then we will end not with comfort, but with names, because names are what erasure cannot fully digest. What we can prove begins with structure. Mississippi in 1964 did not simply have racism. It had an operational system of disenfranchisement. The machinery included discriminatory registration practices, tests and discretion, and the social enforcement that made attempting to register feel like stepping onto a trapdoor. The project known as Freedom Summer did not begin in a vacuum. It was organized, trained, resourced. It was built around a strategic wager. Mass volunteer presence would produce national attention and increase federal pressure, and the building of freedom schools and political organization would create a durable base for Black political agency. That is not romantic. That is logistical. It is documented in the very fact that the movement needed orientation sessions, legal preparation, communication plans, and safety protocols. A society that requires safety protocols for basic political participation is already confessing its own illegitimacy. What we can prove also includes the reality of violence as environment. Not one isolated murder, not one isolated bombing. A pattern, a density. Freedom Summer unfolded in a climate where beatings, threats, arrests, arson, and terror were not anomalies. They were foreseeable. The record, official and human, shows repeated intimidation used to deter Black citizens from registering and to punish those who helped them. The paper language that tries to sanitize it, disturbances, unknown persons, investigation ongoing, does not negate the pattern. It reveals it. When euphemisms repeat, they stop being euphemisms and become signatures. Signatures of procedure. We can prove a specific spine of the summer, June 21st, 1964. Neshoba County. The disappearance and murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. The sequence includes law enforcement custody and release. The bodies are later found concealed. Federal investigation is triggered and expands. That is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of chronology. And chronology, when it aligns with custody and vulnerability, becomes evidence of how power can create the conditions for disappearance without putting a uniformed hand on the trigger in public view. And when, decades later, a conviction is secured in 2005, we can prove something else. Accountability was delayed across a generation. That delay is not simply time passing. It is the measurable distance between what a society knows and what it is willing to prosecute. We can also prove the political confrontation that made the moral question unavoidable. August 1964, Atlantic City, the Democratic National Convention. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenges the legitimacy of the all-white delegation. Fannie Lou Hamer testifies about the brutality and intimidation used against black citizens attempting to participate. The National Party's response becomes a case study in institutional calculus. Preserve unity, minimize disruption, offer compromise, manage optics. Whether you view that as political necessity or moral failure, the documentary fact remains. The Human Archive walked into the official arena and demanded recognition, and the institution tried to accept the demand only in a form that would not force full reckoning. That is the recurring pattern of this entire narrative. Truth allowed to exist, but pressured to shrink. Now what we can infer, carefully without melodrama, but without cowardice, we can infer that the violence functioned as governance, not random hatred, but enforcement. The coordination required for intimidation at scale does not need a single mastermind. It needs shared incentives and predictable non-punishment. If bombings occur and perpetrators remain unknown, if arrests target organizers rather than attackers, if threats silence communities while authorities claim order, you are watching a system. You are watching a feedback loop. Terror produces retreat. Retreat preserves the local order. Preservation rewards those who enforced it. Reward encourages repetition. That loop is governance by fear. We can infer that official record-keeping practices, what was recorded, how it was labeled, what was omitted, were part of the suppression. When you see repeated minimization language, you are not only seeing reporting style, you are seeing a decision about what counts as real. When you see missing pages, you are not only seeing archival decay, you are seeing a gap where accountability would concentrate. When you see decades of sealed surveillance files later forced open, you can infer that secrecy served specific interests. Secrecy is never neutral. It has beneficiaries. We can infer, too, that the Human Archive, oral history, diaries, private correspondence, church testimonies, contains truths that were excluded from official accounts precisely because they were dangerous. The absence of an official report is not proof an event did not happen. In an intimidation regime, absence is often the predictable outcome of fear. That is why the demand for perfect documentation can become a weapon. It punishes victims for the system's success at suppressing documentation. It turns the oppression's method into the skeptic's argument. This is a moral trap, and it has destroyed many attempts at justice. Now the unknowns. There are things we cannot count with certainty because the system did its work. How many people decided not to register after a warning delivered in private? How many local organizers were threatened into silence without ever making a report? How many incidents were negotiated away at the family level? Don't talk, don't bring trouble, move quietly. How many injuries were explained as accidents because telling the truth would invite retaliation? How many names exist only in memory because writing them down was dangerous? These unknowns are not accidental. They are engineered, and that is the point. You cannot blame the historian for missing numbers when the institution's goal was to make numbers missing. So what is the moral truth we must name without hedging? Institutional reputation was protected at human cost, not only by violent actors but by the quiet professionals who minimized, delayed, and reframed, by the officials who treated black citizenship as disorder, by the record keepers who used euphemism to drain moral clarity, by the gatekeepers who demanded tone and balance as the price of publication, by the political managers who treated disenfranchised citizens as negotiable, and by the society that allowed all of this to be called a turbulent time instead of what it was, a deliberate defense of illegitimate power. Now return to the opening image, the archive, the file room, the sealed box. The later decades where records are finally opened, not as confession but as concession. The second discovery is not merely a plot device. It is the proof that the same choice repeats. In 1964, the choice was to suppress participation and manage the narrative. Decades later, the choice becomes to release enough to appear transparent while avoiding full accountability. The vocabulary changes: records access, historical interest, case reopened, but the instinct remains: control the damage. If you are listening for horror, listen for continuity. Monsters are rare, procedures are common, procedures persist. So how do we end this without turning it into a slogan? We end with what the cover-up mechanism hates: the refusal to let names dissolve. The system can survive if it turns people into categories. It can survive if it reduces terror to incidents. It can survive if it delays until witnesses die. It can survive if it makes you tired. But it struggles when you insist on specificity, because specificity builds accountability, and accountability threatens power. Here are the names that refuse to disappear even when the record tries to treat them as footnotes. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. June 21, 1964, Neshoba County, the summer's wound made visible. Fannie Lou Hamer, August 1964, Atlantic City, a voice that turned private terror into public record. And beyond the famous names, the ones the system wanted to keep as unknown persons. The local black citizens who attempted to register and were punished. The families who housed volunteers and paid afterward. The teachers and students in freedom schools who were told that literacy itself was a threat. The organizers who built networks that could not be burned down as easily as buildings. You may not have every name. That is part of the crime. But you can acknowledge the absence as intentional. You can refuse to treat missing as meaningless. And now I will make the final demand of this story, the demand that turns history into responsibility. Do not let this become content you consume and forget. Freedom. Summer is not just a museum exhibit. It is a warning label on democracy. It shows you what happens when a society treats the vote as property rather than right, when law enforcement protects power rather than people, when paperwork is used to launder violence into neutrality, when delay becomes a weapon, when balance becomes an excuse to avoid naming injustice. If you recognize these mechanisms, you owe something to the people who faced them. You owe them more than admiration. You owe them vigilance. If you're listening from Mississippi, say where you're from. If you're listening from anywhere else, say where you're from too. Not for engagement. For the record. Because the first step of suppression is isolation. The feeling that you are alone in your county, alone on your road, alone in your courthouse. And the first step of resistance is to be counted. In 1964, they tried to make counting dangerous. Our responsibility is to count anyway, to record anyway, to refuse the comfort of amnesia.